Paul. The premier Christian apologist alive today is unquestionably William Lane Craig, and he is on record as saying that new atheist Christopher Hitchens is surprised by this new trend of Christians offering reasons for their faith. But of course, Christians have been defending their faith and offering proof for it from day one. During New Testament times, the Apostle Paul was an apologist. We learn about Paul and his apologetic primarily from the book of Acts. There are a number of letters he wrote, but those are more doctrinal than historical in nature. Paul was a Pharisaic Jew who did not follow Christ at first. Then he was on the road to Damascus. On this road, the risen, ascended Jesus appeared to him. From that time on, he was a follower of Jesus. As a Christ follower, he went on various missionary journeys. He first preached the gospel to a primarily Jewish audience, but later focused his attention to primarily Gentiles or a non-Jewish audience. But before he could win a hearing of the gospel, it was necessary he first clear away intellectual stumbling blocks. Aside from presuppositionalists, apologists normally find some sort of common ground with their intended audience and use that common ground to present a case for their faith. A different audience means a different common ground. The argument is from what both parties agree on, the apologist and his audience, to what only the apologist initially agrees on. The goal is to bring the audience over to the apologist's belief. And this is how all teaching learning takes place, is it not? So there's nothing out of the ordinary here. And we find Paul himself using this common ground technique. When he is addressing a synagogue of Jews, he uses the Old Testament as common ground. All those present, presumably, agree that the Old Testament was the authoritative Word of God. If the Old Testament could be shown to teach that Jesus is the Messiah, the Jews present would have to accept Jesus as their Messiah. He takes what they already accept, the common ground of the Old Testament, and moves from it to the uniquely Christian claim of good news. And Paul did not merely assert what he believed and expect others to accept it. He proved it. His audience was free to check out what he was saying for themselves. These Jews had the Old Testament, so they could, read it for themselves and check out what he was saying. And in verse 11 of Acts chapter 17, the Bereans are commended for going through the Old Testament on their own and carefully thinking through what Paul said. I do the same thing. In some of my videos, I explicitly request that you don't merely swallow everything I say, but check out the facts for yourself. Christianity was not done in a corner, as Paul would say. There need not be any doubt in anyone's mind to its truthfulness if they check out the facts for themselves. So when addressing a Jewish audience, Paul would use the common ground of the Old Testament. On the other hand, when Paul is addressing a Gentile audience, he doesn't mention the Bible at all. The Old Testament was not part of the common ground which Paul shared with the Gentile world. Instead, he used Hellenistic philosophy and or the recent events of what objectively occurred with Jesus. So let's turn now to Acts chapter 17 and take a look at an example of Paul addressing a Jewish audience and of him addressing a Gentile audience. First, the Jewish audience. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus, whom I preach unto you, is Christ. And some of them believed, and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. And then down in verse 11 it says, these were more noble, speaking of Berea, the people of Berea, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the scriptures daily, whether those things were so. Okay, so there we have a Jewish, an encounter with a Jewish audience, an apologetic, an apology giving to a Jewish audience, and the common ground there used is the Old Testament. And using the Old Testament, Paul showed that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah of the Old Testament. So the Jews in attendance, once they allow that to filter down through, if they're really going to be intellectually honest, if Paul made his case, they would end up accepting Jesus as the Messiah, and hopefully choose to follow him as well. Well, then we come to a Gentile audience, a Hellenistic philosophy audience, and let's see. So skipping down to verse 16, again, this is Acts chapter 17, starting now in verse 16. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and Stoics encountered him, and some said, what will this babbler say? Others some, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing. So he meets up with some philosophers, some Neoplatonists, the Epicureans and the Stoics, more specifically, and they bring him to the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, and he is going to speak to them there. And we'll look at that in the next video.